without blues, there wouldn't be jazz, quite frankly. It's an essential ingredient in the recipe that makes up all styles of jazz. Many people would argue that it's not jazz if it doesn't have some element of blues in there. And when we're talking about the blues form, most of the time we're referring to a 12-bar blues form. And it's very similar in vibe and in sound to traditional blues form or a rock blues form that evolved from traditional blues forms. But there are a few twists and turns in the form within the 12 bars that are standard in the jazz language. And we're going to take a look at those chord changes in example 1. For guitar players, the first thing to notice, especially if you're just getting into jazz blues progressions for the first time, is that jazz blues tunes are mostly in horn keys, usually in the keys of F or B flat, sometimes in the key of E flat, but almost never in the key of E or A, or these more specific guitar-centric or string-oriented keys. And that's because horns, are their home keys would be F and B flat and E flat and A flat and so on. But I would say the most common key that you'll play blues in would be the key of F. So that's the first consideration, just working your way around the fretboard in this key. The next consideration would be to integrate 2 5s and diminished passing chords in the context of a 12-bar blues progression. So rather than just sticking with 3 chords in a traditional 1-4-5 blues, we have 2 5 1s, we have sharp 4 diminished chords, and lots of chromatic alterations that we can make. And as jazz evolved through the bebop period, post-bop period, and certainly in the modern era, players are continually looking for new ways and new devices that they can superimpose in a blues progression. So let's take a look at the basic architecture. Example 1 moves through a 12-bar blues in the key of F, and let's play through it and then we'll make a few observations. 1, 2, 3, and... Okay, a couple of things to note there. We start off with a 1 chord and then move right to the 4 chord, just as you would see in a traditional blues. And then bars 3 and 4 also outline the 1 chord. And one common cornerstone of all blues progressions, just about, is moving to the 4 chord on the second phrase or in measure 5 of the blues. Just about every, if you're going to call it a blues, it usually has that harmonic move in it. And in jazz blues, that 4 chord is set up with a 2-5 leading into that, and that's exactly what's happening here in the 4th bar. We start off with a C minor chord, moving to an F7, which is the tonic of blues, but in this case is functioning as a 5 leading to the 4 chord, B flat. So, as such, we can alter it. We can put some altered 9s on top of that, which guide your ear to the 4 chord rather nicely. Another thing that is distinctive about the jazz blues from a traditional 1-4-5 blues is in measure 6, that 4 chord quite often goes to a sharp 4 diminished chord. Just a nice little sound there before returning to the 1. And then instead of staying on the 1, we do another 2-5 approach to bar 9, which is the 2 chord. So in this case, that 2 chord is a G minor 7. So we're going to approach that with a 2-5 of G, which would be A minor 7, and then D7, and you can put some altered extensions on top of that if you like, sharp 9, flat 5, sharp 5, or flat 9. In this notation, it's flat 9, which leads nicely into the G minor 7. And then that sets up the following 5, C7, sharp 9, or a flat 9. And then the turnaround. So in traditional blues, there's always a turnaround at the end, something to take our ear back to the top of the form. And usually in traditional blues or in blues rock, that's via some sort of a riff, like a... that kind of a turnaround. In jazz, it's more of a harmonic turnaround, and the most common turnaround would be, or is known as, a 1-6-2-5. So we'll start off, and these are the last two bars. We'll start off with our F7 to a 6, leading into the 2, and then some sort of, voicing for a 5 chord. In this case, it's a C7 sharp 9. When we're moving through those chords, it's like inside, outside, or this movement between tension and resolution. So we have a consonant sounding chord, an unaltered F7, moving to an altered D7. There's the tension, resolution to an unaltered 2, more tension on the 5, which then resolves with a 1 at the top of the form. So that's kind of the jazz version of a turnaround in a blues progression. Let's take a look at some comping strategies over blues progression. We've taken a look at the harmonic structure. Now let's incorporate some voicings and also some rhythmic devices that we explored in earlier chapters, namely the devices of syncopation, which are delayed attack and anticipation. If we combine those rhythmic devices with some of these nice voicings that we explored, we're starting to get into the ballpark in terms of playing blues, convincing blues. Let's take a look at example 2. This is just an example of some chord voicings that sound really nice. When I play blues, I really like to focus on the middle strings because they're just they're fat, they're meaty sounding, they sit really well in the context of a blues progression. They're nice and rich and full sounding. So this example 2 features voicings on the middle 4 strings, and they jump back and forth between the 1 and the 4 chord, and then set up the 4 chord in measure 5 with a 2-5-1. And the 5 of that in that context can also be altered, and that's what we see in this example. So let's give it a shot. Here we go. Example 2. A 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, and. Example 3 picks up where we left off in example 2 with the next 4 bars of the blues progression. We're going to stay on that middle 4 string set and work through some voicings and incorporate diminished chords and a little chromatic approach to the 1 in measures 2 to 3 with the E9 moving up to F9. So here we go. 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, and. In example 4, we start to take a look at some of the substitutions that are common. So example 4 shows an alternate move that you can make. Instead of playing the sharp 4 diminished chord, which would be a B diminished 7, we can also play the flat 7 of the key. So the key center that we're working in is F, so the flat 7 would be E flat. So a flat 7-7 chord is an E flat dominant 7 chord, and that's a wonderful move. So example 4 illustrates that, moving from the 4 chord back to the 1, the tonic chord, via a flat 7-7. Some people call this the backdoor chord, and it's a very common move. So let's take a look at that. A 1, 2, 3, and. The next 2 examples, examples 5A and 5B, explore a couple of different moves that eventually lead us to the last phrase of the blues. So typically in our standard blues progression that we looked at the beginning of this chapter is on measures 7 and 8. We go back to the tonic, and then we set up the 2 chord that happens in bar 9 with a 2-5. But there are a few different ways that we can connect to that 2 chord. One way in example 5A is to move chromatically down in half steps to the D7, which then is the 5 of the 2 chord. Another way in 5B uses an ascending chordal pattern to get us to the G chord. So let's just check out both. Here's example 5A. And just as we saw earlier with our normal turnaround in the blues, we're kind of going back and forth between a consonant chord or an inside chord, we can say, a chord that does not have inherent tension in it, to a chord that does have tension. So we're starting off with a 1 chord. Obviously that won't have tension, and that's going to be just a dominant 9. But then we'll move to an E7 chord that will have an altered extension on it. And it's also a common tone of F9. It sounds really nice. Then we'll flip-flop back to an unaltered chord with the E flat dominant 9. And now move to an outside chord with a D7 sharp 9. And that tension will be resolved with the following 2 chord. Example 5B, we also start with the tonic, the F, but that we move up in whole steps initially, and then we can do a chromatic approach to the 2 chord. So let's check it out. Here's example 5B. We have. Many of you will be familiar with that sound if you know Stormy Monday. T-Bone Walker was a great blues player and jazz player, and he incorporated a lot of jazz harmony into his urban blues style. And that's exactly what's happening here in 5B. We have this wonderful balance between traditional blues, urban blues, and jazz harmony. So what we're doing is we're starting with the F chord, nice low voicing because that gives us a place to move from. So we'll start with an F13 for nice color. We'll move up to a G minor 7, and then the A minor 7. Now from here, you could resolve to a D7 as you normally would, but a nice effect that you can do is just take that A minor 7, move it down a half step, which chromatically approaches the G minor 7. It just slides right into it so nicely. And then we're back at the 2 chord. So those 2 examples give you a couple of varieties to choose from. In the next example, example 6, we'll take a look at the end of the progression, which is the turnaround. Now, normally the turnaround, as we looked at earlier, is 1, 6, 2, 5. We can replace the 6, the 2, and the 5 chords all with their respective tritone substitutions. So if we take a look at that, the 6th chord, the D7, that's replaced with an A flat 7. The G is replaced with a D flat 7. And the C7 is replaced with a G flat 7. And if you put 13 and 9 extensions on them, it sounds like this. In example 6, here we go. A 1, 2, 3, and. Example 7 illustrates very clearly how these tritone substitutions work. So we have D7, A flat 7. So those are chords that are interchangeable, followed by G7, D flat 7, and finally the C7 and G flat 7, those chords are also interchangeable. So not only can you move from F, D, G to C, or the tritone substitutions as in example 6, but you can combine any of those. So for example, you could go F to A flat, and then move down to G, and then G flat. Or any combinations of the original chords with their respective tritone substitutions. They'll all sound great. Okay, let's take a look at some soloing strategies that you can employ in the blues. Example 8 features a very common way of just outlining the blues chord per chord, just like we've been looking at throughout this book. We're thinking vertically, we're really focusing on chord tones for each individual chord, and we're employing a lot of different rhythmic ideas, rhythmic motives, triplet rhythms, anticipation, delayed attacks. So example 8 just kind of gives you a very traditional approach to outlining these changes. We're targeting certain notes, such as in the 4th bar, the F7 flat 9. We're incorporating that into our line. But there are some other things that you can do to really bring this progression to life. In example 9, we take a look at chromaticism, and we're just really taking the line from example 8 and adding a few more chromatic approaches in there. In measure 1, we're starting off with like a really long chromatically descending line approaching the A flat of the B flat 7. And then we move right up the arpeggio of B flat 7. And then we do a chromatic enclosure back to the F. And that's a very common move in bebop playing, is this sort of double chromatic enclosure. If we were going to approach or target the F, we're going to chromatically approach that from both sides. So G flat, E natural, F, and we can do like a little ornamentation by doing this little triplet rhythm. Or either one will work fine, but F sharp to G natural down to E, we've basically exhausted all of the possibilities except for F, all of the the neighbor tones there. So there's lots of different variations on that theme. Looking forward, the last two measures of this particular example, you can also use chromaticism in your chord that you're outlining. So previously we had a C minor 7 moving to an F7 chord, but in this particular example we have a C minor 7 that's outlined here, and then we can move chromatically down to a B7 or a B triad and outline that, and then move down another half step chromatically to B flat 7. And that's really nice to play a B7 triad over an F7 because you're implying a tritone substitution in your lead line. In example 10, we can take a look at another concept that's very common in blues, playing on the 5 minor. This is a technique that Wes Montgomery loved to use. George Benson uses this technique. It's really a wonderful sound. So the idea is that on every chord, you can play ideas, minor ideas, on the 5 of that particular chord. So for example, if we're working with an F7, we can play C minor ideas because C is the 5 of F. So that's what's happening here in the first bar. We're basically outlining a C minor triad, or C minor 7, and that moves right into an F minor 7 idea, which is happening over the B flat 7 chord. So F is the 5 of B flat. So over this B flat 7 chord, we're going to play F minor 7 ideas. Back to a C minor over F7. Then on our 2-5 of B flat, on the C minor 7, we're outlining a G minor, and then we'll just use a chromatic approach and outline F sharp minor 7 over the F altered. And we saw this device in earlier chapters, but it's a really great chromatic move. We can go G minor to F sharp minor 7, outlining this F altered sound, and then resolve that to an F minor over the B flat down another half step. And finally, in example 11, of course, we can use the blues scale, and that sounds right at home in a blues progression. And that's what's going on throughout example 11. So sometimes guitar players can be, can shy away from using blues licks or blues vocabulary in a jazz context because they think that it's not hip enough or it doesn't work, or they have some kind of a little bit of a complex using a pentatonic scale or a blues. Don't even worry about that. This is a blues progression. Blues licks feel totally at home. And that's what's happening here. We're starting off this line using the F minor blues scale. And that sounds just beautiful over an F7. And then we can answer that over the B flat 7. And then even over the context of a 2-5, we're just playing a straight up blues line. And that, again, is a very refreshing way to approach a blues if you're playing a lot of, vertical approaches, a lot of chromaticism, a lot of bebop lines. Just starting and finishing a phrase with a solid blues idea or a blues lick can be a really powerful statement in the context of your solo.